Chapters 36 and 37 of The Portrait of a Lady, by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. One afternoon of the autumn of 1876, toward dusk, a young man of pleasing appearance rang at the door of a small apartment on the third floor of an old Roman house. On its being opened, he inquired for Madame Merle, whereupon the servant, a neat plain woman, with a French face and a lady's maid manner, ushered him into a diminutive drawing-room and requested the favour of his name. "Mr. Edward Rozier," said the young man, who sat down to wait till his hostess should appear. The reader will perhaps not have forgotten that Mr. Rozier was an ornament of the American circle in Paris, but it may also be remembered that he sometimes vanished from its horizon. He had spent a portion of several winters at Pau, and as he was a gentleman of constituted habits, he might have continued for years to pay his annual visit to this charming resort. In the summer of 1876, however, an incident befell him which changed the current not only of his thoughts, but of his customary sequences. He passed a month in the Upper Engadine, and encountered at St. Moritz a charming young girl. To this little person he began to pay, on the spot, particular attention. She struck him as exactly the household angel he had long been looking for. He was never precipitate, he was nothing if not discreet, so he forbore for the present to declare his passion. But it seemed to him when they parted, the young lady to go down into Italy, and her admirer to proceed to Geneva, where he was under bonds to join other friends, that he should be romantically wretched if he were not to see her again. The simplest way to do so was to go in the autumn to Rome, where Miss Osmond was domiciled with her family. Mr. Rozier started on his pilgrimage to the Italian capital, and reached it on the 1st of November. It was a pleasant thing to do, but for the young man there was a strain of the heroic in the enterprise. He might expose himself, unseasoned, to the poison of the Roman air, which in November lay notoriously much in wait. Fortune, however, favours the brave, and this adventurer, who took 3 grains of quinine a day, had at the end of the month no cause to deplore his temerity. He had made to a certain extent good use of his time. He had devoted it in vain to finding a flaw in Pansy Osmond's composition. She was admirably finished. She had had the last touch. She was really a consummate piece. He thought of her in amorous meditation a good deal, as he might have thought of a Dresden china shepherdess. Miss Osmond, indeed, in the bloom of her juvenility, had a hint of the rococo which Rozier, whose taste was predominantly for that manner, could not fail to appreciate. That he esteemed the productions of comparatively frivolous periods would have been apparent from the attention he bestowed upon Madame Merle's drawing-room, which, although furnished with specimens of every style, was especially rich in articles of the last 2 centuries. He had immediately put a glass into one eye and looked round, and then, "By Jove, she has some jolly good things," he had yearningly murmured. The room was small and densely filled with furniture. It gave an impression of faded silk and little statuettes, which might totter if once moved. Rozier got up and wandered about with his careful tread, bending over the tables charged with knick-knacks, and the cushions embossed with princely arms. When Madame Merle came in, she found him standing before the fireplace, with his nose very close to the great lace flounce attached to the damask cover of the mantel. He had lifted it delicately, as if he were smelling it. "It's old Venetian," she said. "It's rather good." "It's too good for this. You ought to wear it." "They tell me that you have some better in Paris, in the same situation." "Ah, but I can't wear mine," smiled the visitor. "I don't see why you shouldn't. I've better lace than that to wear." His eyes wandered lingeringly round the room again. "You've got some very good things." "Yes, but I hate them." "Do you want to get rid of them?" the young man quickly asked. "No, it's good to have something to hate. One works it off." "I love my things," said Mr. Rozier, as he sat there flushed with all his recognitions. "But it's not about them, nor about yours, that I came to talk to you." He paused a moment, and then, with greater softness, said, "I care more for Miss Osmond than for all the bibelots in Europe." Madame Merle opened wide eyes. "Did you come to tell me that?" "I came to ask your advice." She looked at him with a friendly frown, stroking her chin with her large white hand. "A man in love, you know, doesn't ask advice." "Why not, if he's in a difficult position? That's often the case with a man in love. I've been in love before, and I know. But never so much as this time, really never so much. I should like particularly to know what you think of my prospects. I'm afraid that for Mr. Osmond I'm not, a real collector's piece." "Do you wish me to intercede?" Madame Merle asked, with her fine arms folded and her handsome mouth drawn up to the left. "If you could say a good word for me, I should be greatly obliged. There will be no use in my troubling Miss Osmond unless I have good reason to believe her father will consent." "You're very considerate. That's in your favour. But you assume, in rather an off-hand way, that I think you a prize." "You've been very kind to me," said the young man. "That's why I came." "I'm always kind to people who have good Louis Quatorze. It's very rare now, and there's no telling what one may get by it." With which the left-hand corner of Madame Merle's mouth gave expression to the joke. But he looked, in spite of it, literally apprehensive and consistently strenuous. "Ah, I thought you liked me for myself." "I like you very much, but if you please we won't analyze. Pardon me if I seem patronizing, but I think you a perfect little gentleman. I must tell you, however, that I've not the marrying of Pansy Osmond." "I didn't suppose that. But you seem to me intimate with her family, and I thought you might have influence." Madame Merle considered. "Whom do you call her family?" "Why, her father, and how do you say it in English, her belle-mère?" "Mr. Osmond's her father, certainly, but his wife can scarcely be termed a member of her family. Mrs. Osmond has nothing to do with marrying her." "I'm sorry for that," said Rozier, with an amiable sigh of good faith. "I think Mrs. Osmond would favour me." "Very likely, if her husband doesn't." He raised his eyebrows. "Does she take the opposite line from him?" "In everything. They think quite differently." "Well," said Rozier, "I'm sorry for that, but it's none of my business. She's very fond of Pansy." "Yes, she's very fond of Pansy." "And Pansy has a great affection for her. She has told me how she loves her, as if she were her own mother." "You must, after all, have had some very intimate talk with the poor child," said Madame Merle. "Have you declared your sentiments?" "Never!" cried Rozier, lifting his neatly gloved hand. "Never till I've assured myself of those of the parents." "You always wait for that? You've excellent principles. You observe the proprieties." "I think you're laughing at me," the young man murmured, dropping back in his chair and feeling his small moustache. "I didn't expect that of you, Madame Merle." She shook her head calmly, like a person who saw things as she saw them. "You don't do me justice. I think your conduct in excellent taste, and the best you could adopt. Yes, that's what I think." "I wouldn't agitate her, only to agitate her. I love her too much for that," said Ned Rozier. "I'm glad, after all, that you've told me," Madame Merle went on. "Leave it to me a little. I think I can help you." "I said you were the person to come to," her visitor cried, with prompt elation. "You are very clever," Madame Merle returned more dryly. "When I say I can help you, I mean once assuming your cause to be good. Let us think a little if it is." "I'm awfully decent, you know," said Rozier earnestly. "I won't say I've no faults, but I'll say I have no vices." "All that's negative, and it always depends, also, on what people call vices. What's the positive side? What's the virtuous? What have you got besides your Spanish lace and your Dresden teacups?" "I've a comfortable little fortune, about 40,000 francs a year. With the talent I have for arranging, we can live beautifully on such an income." "Beautifully, no. Sufficiently, yes. Even that depends on where you live." "Well, in Paris. I would undertake it in Paris." Madame Merle's mouth rose to the left. "It wouldn't be famous. You'd have to make use of the teacups, and they'd get broken." "We don't want to be famous. If Miss Osmond should have everything pretty, it would be enough. When one's as pretty as she, one can afford, well, quite cheap faience. She ought never to wear anything but muslin, without the sprig," said Roger, reflectively. "Wouldn't you even allow her the sprig? She'd be much obliged to you at any rate for that theory." "It's the correct one, I assure you, and I'm sure she'd enter into it. She understands all that. That's why I love her." "She's a very good little girl, and most tidy, also extremely grateful. But her father, to the best of my belief, can give her nothing." Roger scarce demurred. "I don't in the least desire that he should. But I may remark, all the same, that he lives like a rich man." "The money's his wife's. She brought him a large fortune." "Mrs. Osmond, then, is very fond of her stepdaughter. She may do something." "For a love-sick swain, you have your eyes about you!" Madame Merle exclaimed with a laugh. "I esteem a dot very much. I can do without it, but I esteem it." "Mrs. Osmond," Madame Merle went on, "will probably prefer to keep her money for her own children." "Her own children? Surely she has none." "She may have yet. She had a poor little boy, who died 2 years ago, 6 months after his birth. Others, therefore, may come." "I hope they will, if it will make her happy. She's a splendid woman." Madame Merle failed to burst into speech. "Ah, about her there's much to be said." "Splendid as you like. We've not exactly made out that you're a parti. The absence of vices is hardly a source of income." "Pardon me, I think it may be," said Roger, quite lucidly. "You'll be a touching couple, living on your innocence." "I think you underrate me." "You're not so innocent as that? Seriously," said Madame Merle, "of course 40,000 francs a year and a nice character are a combination to be considered. I don't say it's to be jumped at, but there might be a worse offer. Mr. Osmond, however, will probably incline to believe he can do better." "He can do so, perhaps. But what can his daughter do? She can't do better than marry the man she loves. For she does, you know," Roger added eagerly. "She does. I know it." "Ah," cried the young man, "I said you were the person to come to." "But I don't know how you know it, if you haven't asked her," Madame Merle went on. "In such a case there's no need of asking and telling. As you say, we're an innocent couple. How did you know it?" "I, who am not innocent? By being very crafty. Leave it to me. I'll find out for you." Roger got up and stood smoothing his hat. "You say that rather coldly. Don't simply find out how it is, but try to make it as it should be." "I'll do my best. I'll try to make the most of your advantages." "Thank you so very much. Meanwhile, then, I'll say a word to Mrs. Osmond." "Gardez-vous-en bien," and Madame Merle was on her feet. "Don't set her going, or you'll spoil everything." Roger gazed into his hat. He wondered whether his hostess had been, after all, the right person to come to. "I don't think I understand you. I'm an old friend of Mrs. Osmond, and I think she would like me to succeed." "Be an old friend as much as you like. The more old friends she has the better, for she doesn't get on very well with some of her new. But don't for the present try to make her take up the cudgels for you. Her husband may have other views, and, as a person who wishes her well, I advise you not to multiply points of difference between them." Poor Roger's face assumed an expression of alarm. A suit for the hand of Pansy Osmond was even a more complicated business than his taste for proper transitions had allowed. But the extreme good sense which he concealed under a surface suggesting that of a careful owner's best set came to his assistance. "I don't see that I'm bound to consider Mr. Osmond so very much," he exclaimed. "No, but you should consider her. You say you're an old friend. Would you make her suffer?" "Not for the world." "Then be very careful, and let the matter alone till I've taken a few soundings." "Let the matter alone, dear Madame Merle? Remember that I'm in love." "Oh, you won't burn up. Why did you come to me if you're not to heed what I say?" "You're very kind. I'll be very good," the young man promised. "But I'm afraid Mr. Osmond's pretty hard," he added in his mild voice as he went to the door. Madame Merle gave a short laugh. "It has been said before. But his wife isn't easy either." "Ah, she's a splendid woman," Ned Roser repeated for departure. He resolved that his conduct should be worthy of an aspirant who was already a model of discretion, but he saw nothing in any pledge he had given Madame Merle that made it improper that he should keep himself in spirits by an occasional visit to Miss Osmond's home. He reflected constantly on what his adviser had said to him, and turned over in his mind the impression of her rather circumspect tone. He had gone to her de confiance, as they put it in Paris, but it was possible he had been precipitate. He found difficulty in thinking of himself as rash. He had incurred this reproach so rarely. But it certainly was true that he had known Madame Merle only for the last month, and that his thinking her a delightful woman was not, when one came to look at it, a reason for assuming that she would be eager to push Pansy Osmond into his arms, gracefully arranged as these members might be to receive her. She had indeed shown him benevolence, and she was a person of consideration among the girl's people, where she had a rather striking appearance (Roger had more than once wondered how she managed it) of being intimate without being familiar. But possibly he had exaggerated these advantages. There was no particular reason why she should take trouble for him. A charming woman was charming to every one, and Roger felt rather a fool when he thought of his having appealed to her on the ground that she had distinguished him. Very likely, though she had appeared to say it in joke, she was really only thinking of his bibelot. Had it come into her head that he might offer her 2 or 3 of the gems of his collection? If she would only help him marry Miss Osmond, he would present her with his whole museum. He could hardly say so to her outright. It would seem too gross a bribe. But he should like her to believe it. It was with these thoughts that he went again to Mrs. Osmond's, Mrs. Osmond having an evening. She had taken the Thursday of each week, when his presence could be accounted for on general principles of civility. The object of Mr. Roser's well-regulated affection dwelt in a high house in the very heart of Rome, a dark and massive structure overlooking a sunny piazzetta in the neighborhood of the Farnese Palace. In a palace, too, little Pansy lived, a palace by Roman measure, but a dungeon to poor Roger's apprehensive mind. It seemed to him of evil omen that the young lady he wished to marry, and whose fastidious father he doubted of his ability to conciliate, should be immured in a kind of domestic fortress, a pile which bore a stern old Roman name, which smelt of historic deeds, of crime and craft and violence, which was mentioned in Murray and visited by tourists who looked, on a vague survey, disappointed and depressed, and which had frescoes by Caravaggio in the Piano Nobile, and a row of mutilated statues and dusty urns in the wide, nobly arched loggia overhanging the damp court, where a fountain gushed out of a mossy niche. In a less preoccupied frame of mind he could have done justice to the Palazzo Roccanera. He could have entered into the sentiment of Mrs. Osmond, who had once told him that on settling themselves in Rome she and her husband had chosen this habitation for the love of local colour. It had local colour enough, and though he knew less about architecture than about Limoges enamels, he could see that the proportions of the windows and even the details of the cornice had quite the grand air. But Roger was haunted by the conviction that at picturesque periods young girls had been shut up there to keep them from their true loves, and then, under the threat of being thrown into convents, had been forced into unholy marriages. There was one point, however, to which he always did justice when once he found himself in Mrs. Osmond's warm, rich-looking reception-rooms, which were on the second floor. He acknowledged that these people were very strong in good things. It was a taste of Osmond's own, not at all of hers. This she had told him the first time he came to the house, when, after asking himself for a quarter of an hour whether they had even better French than he in Paris, he was obliged on the spot to admit that they had very much, and vanquished his envy, as a gentleman should, to the point of expressing to his hostess his pure admiration of their treasures. He learned from Mrs. Osmond that her husband had made a large collection before their marriage, and that though he had annexed a number of fine pieces within the last 3 years, he had achieved his greatest finds at a time when he had not the advantage of her advice. Roger interpreted this information according to principles of his own, for advice read cash, he said to himself, and the fact that Gilbert Osmond had landed his highest prizes during his impecunious season confirmed his most cherished doctrine, the doctrine that a collector may freely be poor if he be only patient. In general, when Roger presented himself on a Thursday evening, his first recognition was for the walls of the saloon. There were 3 or 4 objects his eyes really yearned for. But after his talk with Madame Merle, he felt the extreme seriousness of his position, and now, when he came in, he looked about for the daughter of the house with such eagerness as might be permitted a gentleman whose smile, as he crossed a threshold, always took everything comfortable for granted. Chapter 37. Pansy was not in the first of the rooms. A large apartment with a concave ceiling and walls covered with old red damask. It was here Mrs. Osmond usually sat, though she was not in her most customary place to-night, and that a circle of more special intimates gathered about the fire. The room was flushed with subdued, diffused brightness. It contained the larger things, and almost always an odour of flowers. Pansy on this occasion was presumably in the next of the series, the resort of younger visitors, where tea was served. Osmond stood before the chimney, leaning back with his hands behind him. He had one foot up and was warming the sole. 6 persons scattered near him were talking together, but he was not in the conversation. His eyes had an expression, frequent with them, that seemed to represent them as engaged with objects more worth their while than the appearances actually thrust upon them. Roger, coming in unannounced, failed to attract his attention, but the young man, who was very punctilious, though he was even exceptionally conscious that it was the wife, not the husband, he had come to see, went up to shake hands with him. Osmond put out his left hand without changing his attitude. "How d'ye do? My wife's somewhere about." "Never fear, I shall find her," said Roger cheerfully. Osmond, however, took him in. He had never in his life felt himself so efficiently looked at. "Madame Merle has told him, and he doesn't like it," he privately reasoned. He had hoped Madame Merle would be there, but she was not in sight. Perhaps she was in one of the other rooms, or would come later. He had never especially delighted in Gilbert Osmond, having a fancy he gave himself airs. But Roger was not quickly resentful, and where politeness was concerned had ever a strong need of being quite in the right. He looked around him and smiled, all without help, and then in a moment, "I saw a jolly good piece of Capodimonte to-day," he said. Osmond answered nothing at first, but presently, while he warmed his boot sole, "I don't care a fig for Capodimonte," he returned. "I hope you're not losing your interest." In old pots and plates, yes, I'm losing my interest." Rozier for an instant forgot the delicacy of his position. "You're not thinking of parting with a piece or two?" "No, I'm not thinking of parting with anything at all, Mr. Rozier," said Osmond, with his eyes still on the eyes of his visitor. "Ah, you want to keep, but not to add," Rozier remarked brightly. "Exactly. I've nothing I wish to match." Poor Rozier was aware he had blushed. He was distressed at his want of assurance. "Ah, well, I have," was all he could murmur, and he knew his murmur was partly lost as he turned away. He took his course to the adjoining room and met Mrs. Osmond coming out of the deep doorway. She was dressed in black velvet. She looked high and splendid, as he had said, and yet oh so radiantly gentle. We know what Mr. Rozier thought of her, and the terms in which, to Madame Merle, he had expressed his admiration. Like his appreciation of her dear little stepdaughter, it was based partly on his eye for decorative character, his instinct for authenticity, but also on a sense for uncatalogued values, for that secret of a lustre beyond any recorded losing or rediscovering, which his devotion to brittle wares had still not disqualified him to recognize. Mrs. Osmond at present might well have gratified such tastes. The years had touched her only to enrich her. The flower of her youth had not faded. It only hung more quietly on its stem. She had lost something of that quick eagerness to which her husband had privately taken exception. She had more the air of being able to wait. Now, at all events, framed in the gilded doorway, she struck our young man as the picture of a gracious lady. "You see, I'm very regular," he said, "but who should be if I'm not?" "Yes, I've known you longer than any one here, but we mustn't indulge in tender reminiscences. I want to introduce you to a young lady." "Ah, please, what young lady?" Rozier was immensely obliging, but this was not what he had come for. "She sits there by the fire in pink and has no one to speak to." Rozier hesitated a moment. "Can't Mr. Osmond speak to her? He's within 6 feet of her." Mrs. Osmond also hesitated. "She's not very lively, and he doesn't like dull people." "But she's good enough for me. Ah, now that's hard." "I only mean that you've ideas for two, and then you're so obliging." "So is your husband." "No, he's not to me," and Mrs. Osmond vaguely smiled. "That's a sign he should be doubly so to other women." "So I tell him," she said, still smiling. "You see, I want some tea," Rozier went on, looking wistfully beyond. "That's perfect. Go and give some to my young lady." "Very good, but after that I'll abandon her to her fate. The simple truth is, I'm dying to have a little talk with Miss Osmond." "Ah," said Isabel, turning away, "I can't help you there." 5 minutes later, while he handed a teacup to the damsel in pink, whom he had conducted into the other room, he wondered whether, in making to Mrs. Osmond the profession I have just quoted, he had broken the spirit of his promise to Madame Merle. Such a question was capable of occupying this young man's mind for a considerable time. At last, however, he became, comparatively speaking, reckless. He cared little what promises he might break. The fate to which he had threatened to abandon the damsel in pink proved to be none so terrible, for Pansy Osmond, who had given him the tea for his companion — Pansy was as fond as ever of making tea — presently came and talked to her. Into this mild colloquy Edward Rozier entered little. He sat by moodily, watching his small sweetheart. If we look at her now through his eyes, we shall at first not see much to remind us of the obedient little girl who at Florence, 3 years before, was sent to walk short distances in the Cascine while her father and Miss Archer talked together of matters sacred to elder people. But after a moment we shall perceive that if at 19 Pansy has become a young lady, she doesn't really fill out the part; that if she has grown very pretty, she lacks in a deplorable degree the quality known and esteemed in the appearance of females as style, and that if she is dressed with great freshness, she wears her smart attire with an undisguised appearance of saving it, very much as if it were lent her for the occasion. Edward Rozier, it would seem, would have been just the man to note these defects, and in point of fact there was not a quality of this young lady of any sort that he had not noted. Only he called her qualities by names of his own, some of which indeed were happy enough. "No, she's unique, she's absolutely unique," he used to say to himself, and you may be sure that not for an instant would he have admitted to you that she was wanting in style. Style? Why, she had the style of a little princess. If you couldn't see it, you had no eye. It was not modern, it was not conscious, it would produce no impression in Broadway. The small, serious damsel, in her stiff little dress, only looked like an Infanta of Velasquez. This was enough for Edward Rozier, who thought her delightfully old-fashioned. Her anxious eyes, her charming lips, her slip of a figure, were as touching as a childish prayer. He had now an acute desire to know just to what point she liked him, a desire which made him fidget as he sat in his chair. It made him feel hot, so that he had to pat his forehead with his handkerchief. He had never been so uncomfortable. She was such a perfect jeune fille, and one couldn't make of a jeune fille the inquiry requisite for throwing light on such a point. A jeune fille was what Rozier had always dreamed of, a jeune fille who should yet not be French, for he had felt that this nationality would complicate the question. He was sure Pansy had never looked at a newspaper, and that in the way of novels, if she had read Sir Walter Scott, it was the very most. An American jeune fille, what could be better than that? She would be frank and gay, yet would not have walked alone, nor have received letters from men, nor have been taken to the theatre to see the Comedy of Manners. Rozier could not deny that, as the matter stood, it would be a breach of hospitality to appeal directly to this unsophisticated creature, but he was now in imminent danger of asking himself if hospitality were the most sacred thing in the world. Was not the sentiment that he entertained for Miss Osmond of infinitely greater importance? Of greater importance to him, yes, but not probably to the master of the house. There was one comfort. Even if this gentleman had been placed on his guard by Madame Merle, he would not have extended the warning to Pansy. It would not have been part of his policy to let her know that a prepossessing young man was in love with her. But he was in love with her, the prepossessing young man, and all these restrictions of circumstance had ended by irritating him. What had Gilbert Osmond meant by giving him 2 fingers of his left hand? If Osmond was rude, surely he himself might be bold. He felt extremely bold after the dull girl in so vain a disguise of rose-colour had responded to the call of her mother, who came in to say, with a significant simper at Rozier, that she must carry her off to other triumphs. The mother and daughter departed together, and now it depended only upon him that he should be virtually alone with Pansy. He had never been alone with her before. He had never been alone with a jeune fille. It was a great moment. Poor Rozier began to pat his forehead again. There was another room beyond the one in which they stood, a small room that had been thrown open and lighted, but that, the company not being numerous, had remained empty all the evening. It was empty yet. It was upholstered in pale yellow. There were several lamps. Through the open door it looked the very temple of authorized love. Rozier gazed a moment through this aperture. He was afraid that Pansy would run away, and felt almost capable of stretching out a hand to detain her. But she lingered where the other maiden had left them, making no motion to join a knot of visitors on the far side of the room. For a little it occurred to him that she was frightened, too frightened perhaps to move. But a second glance assured him she was not, and he then reflected that she was too innocent indeed for that. After a supreme hesitation, he asked her if he might go and look at the yellow room, which seemed so attractive yet so virginal. He had been there already with Osmond to inspect the furniture, which was of the first French Empire, and especially to admire the clock, which he didn't really admire, an immense classic structure of that period. He therefore felt that he had now begun to manoeuvre. "Certainly you may go," said Pansy, "and if you like I'll show you." She was not in the least frightened. "That's just what I hoped you'd say. You're so very kind," Rosa murmured. They went in together. Rosa really thought the room very ugly, and it seemed cold. The same idea appeared to have struck Pansy. "It's not for winter evenings, it's more for summer," she said. "It's papa's taste. He has so much." He had a good deal, Rosa thought, but some of it was very bad. He looked about him. He hardly knew what to say in such a situation. "Doesn't Mrs. Osmond care how her rooms are done? Has she no taste?" he asked. "Oh yes, a great deal, but it's more for literature," said Pansy, "and for conversation. But papa cares also for those things. I think he knows everything." Rosa was silent a little. "There's one thing I'm sure he knows," he broke out presently. "He knows that when I come here it's, with all respect to him, with all respect to Mrs. Osmond, who's so charming, it's really," said the young man, "to see you." "To see me?" And Pansy raised her vaguely troubled eyes. "To see you. That's what I come for," Rosa repeated, feeling the intoxication of a rupture with authority. Pansy stood looking at him, simply, intently, openly. A blush was not needed to make her face more modest. "I thought it was for that." "And it was not disagreeable to you?" "I couldn't tell. I didn't know. You never told me," said Pansy. "I was afraid of offending you." "You don't offend me," the young girl murmured, smiling as if an angel had kissed her. "You like me then, Pansy?" Rosa asked very gently, feeling very happy. "Yes, I like you." They had walked to the chimney-piece where the big, cold Empire clock was perched. They were well within the room and beyond observation from without. The tone in which she had said these 4 words seemed to him the very breath of nature, and his only answer could be to take her hand and hold it for a moment. Then he raised it to his lips. She submitted, still with her pure, trusting smile, in which there was something ineffably passive. She liked him, she had liked him all the while. Now anything might happen. She was ready, she had been ready always, waiting for him to speak. If he had not spoken, she would have waited for ever, but when the word came she dropped like the peach from the shaken tree. Rosa felt that if he should draw her toward him and hold her to his heart, she would submit without a murmur, would rest there without a question. It was true that this would be a rash experiment in a yellow Empire salottino. She had known it was for her that he came, and yet, like what a perfect little lady, she had carried it off. "You're very dear to me," he murmured, trying to believe that there was after all such a thing as hospitality. She looked a moment at her hand where he had kissed it. "Did you say papa knows?" "You told me just now he knows everything." "I think you must make sure," said Pansy. "Ah, my dear, when once I'm sure of you," Rosa murmured in her ear. Whereupon she turned back to the other rooms with a little air of consistency which seemed to imply that their appeal should be immediate. The other rooms, meanwhile, had become conscious of the arrival of Madame Merle, who, wherever she went, produced an impression when she entered. How she did it the most attentive spectator could not have told you, for she neither spoke loud, nor laughed profusely, nor moved rapidly, nor dressed with splendour, nor appealed in any appreciable manner to the audience. Large, fair, smiling, serene, there was something in her very tranquillity that diffused itself, and when people looked around it was because of a sudden quiet. On this occasion she had done the quietest thing she could do. After embracing Mrs. Osmond, which was more striking, she had sat down on a small sofa to commune with the master of the house. There was a brief exchange of commonplaces between these two. They always paid, in public, a certain formal tribute to the commonplace. And then Madame Merle, whose eyes had been wandering, asked if little Mr. Rozier had come this evening. "He came nearly an hour ago, but he has disappeared," Osmond said. "And where's Pansy?" "In the other room. There are several people there." "He's probably among them," said Madame Merle. "Do you wish to see him?" Osmond asked in a provokingly pointless tone. Madame Merle looked at him a moment. She knew each of his tones to the eighth of a note. "Yes, I should like to say to him that I've told you what he wants, and that it interests you but feebly." "Don't tell him that. He'll try to interest me more, which is exactly what I don't want. Tell him I hate his proposal." "But you don't hate it." "It doesn't signify. I don't love it. I let him see that myself this evening. I was rude to him on purpose. That sort of thing's a great bore. There's no hurry." "I'll tell him that you'll take time and think it over." "No, don't do that. He'll hang on." "If I discourage him, he'll do the same." "Yes, but in the one case he'll try to talk and explain, which would be exceedingly tiresome. In the other he'll probably hold his tongue and go in for some deeper game. That will leave me quiet. I hate talking with a donkey." "Is that what you call poor Mr. Rozier?" "Oh, he's a nuisance, with his eternal Maiolica." Madame Merle dropped her eyes. She had a faint smile. "He's a gentleman, he has a charming temper, and, after all, an income of 40,000 francs." "It's misery, genteel misery," Osmond broke in. "It's not what I've dreamed of for Pansy." "Very good, then. He has promised me not to speak to her." "Do you believe him?" Osmond asked absent-mindedly. "Perfectly. Pansy has thought a great deal about him, but I don't suppose you consider that matters." "I don't consider it matters at all, but neither do I believe she has thought of him." "That opinion's more convenient," said Madame Merle quietly. "Has she told you she's in love with him?" "For what do you take her? And for what do you take me?" Madame Merle added in a moment. Osmond had raised his foot and was resting his slim ankle on the other knee. He clasped his ankle in his hand familiarly. His long fine forefinger and thumb could make a ring for it, and gazed a while before him. "This kind of thing doesn't find me unprepared. It's what I educated her for. It was all for this, that when such a case should come up, she should do what I prefer." "I'm afraid that she'll not do it." "Well, then, where's the hitch?" "I don't see any, but all the same I recommend you not to get rid of Mr. Rozier. Keep him on hand. He may be useful." "I can't keep him. Keep him yourself." "Very good. I'll put him into a corner and allow him so much a day." Madame Merle had, for the most part, while they talked, been glancing about her. It was her habit in this situation, just as it was her habit to interpose a good many blank-looking pauses. A long drop followed the last words I have quoted, and before it had ended she saw Pansy come out of the adjoining room, followed by Edward Rozier. The girl advanced a few steps and then stopped and stood looking at Madame Merle and at her father. "He has spoken to her," Madame Merle went on to Osmond. Her companion never turned his head. "So much for your belief in his promises. He ought to be horsewhipped." "He intends to confess, poor little man." Osmond got up. He had now taken a sharp look at his daughter. "It doesn't matter," he murmured, turning away. Pansy, after a moment, came up to Madame Merle with her little manner of unfamiliar politeness. This lady's reception of her was not more intimate. She simply, as she rose from the sofa, gave her a friendly smile. "You're very late," the young creature gently said. "My dear child, I'm never later than I intend to be." Madame Merle had not got up to be gracious to Pansy. She moved toward Edward Rozier. He came to meet her, and very quickly, as if to get it off his mind. "I've spoken to her," he whispered. "I know it, Mr. Rozier." "Did she tell you?" "Yes, she told me. Behave properly for the rest of the evening, and come and see me to-morrow at 5:15. She was severe, and in the manner in which she turned her back to him there was a degree of contempt which caused him to mutter a decent imprecation. He had no intention of speaking to Osmond. It was neither the time nor the place. But he instinctively wandered toward Isabel, who sat talking with an old lady. He sat down on the other side of her. The old lady was Italian, and Rozier took it for granted she understood no English. "You said just now you wouldn't help me," he began to Mrs. Osmond. "Perhaps you'll feel differently when you know—" Isabel met his hesitation. "When I know what?" "That she's all right." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, that we've come to an understanding." "She's all wrong," said Isabel. "It won't do." Poor Rozier gazed at her half pleadingly, half angrily. A sudden flush testified to his sense of injury. "I've never been treated so," he said. "What is there against me, after all? That's not the way I'm usually considered. I could have married 20 times." "It's a pity you didn't. I don't mean 20 times, but once, comfortably," Isabel added, smiling kindly. "You're not rich enough for Pansy." "She doesn't care a straw for one's money." "No, but her father does." "Ah, yes, he has proved that," cried the young man. Isabel got up, turning away from him, leaving her old lady without ceremony, and he occupied himself for the next 10 minutes in pretending to look at Gilbert Osmond's collection of miniatures, which were neatly arranged on a series of small velvet screens. But he looked without seeing. His cheek burned. He was too full of his sense of injury. It was certain that he had never been treated that way before. He was not used to being thought not good enough. He knew how good he was, and if such a fallacy had not been so pernicious, he could have laughed at it. He searched again for Pansy, but she had disappeared, and his main desire was now to get out of the house. Before doing so, he spoke once more to Isabel. It was not agreeable to him to reflect that he had just said a rude thing to her, the only point that would now justify a low view of him. "I referred to Mr. Osmond as I shouldn't have done a while ago," he began. "But you must remember my situation." "I don't remember what you said," she answered coldly. "Ah, you're offended, and now you'll never help me." She was silent an instant, and then with a change of tone, "It's not that I won't. I simply can't." Her manner was almost passionate. "If you could, just a little, I'd never speak of your husband save as an angel." "The inducement's great," said Isabel gravely, inscrutably, as he afterwards to himself called it, and she gave him, straight in the eyes, a look which was also inscrutable. It made him remember, somehow, that he had known her as a child, and yet it was keener than he liked, and he took himself off. Chapter 37